dominant way out. I think a lot of us don't necessarily like masking up all the time, but that's where we've kind of been stuck as far as limiting the spread of this disease. We know masks are pretty effective, only in the sense that influenza has been non-existent this year. So, despite that fact, I would prefer to eventually get this thing over with, get out of masks, move on with life. So, prevention in medicine is a key feature. It doesn't get a lot of attention at times, but it's a very important part. And so vaccines are a major component of preventative medicine. So what we're going to do is just go through the different vaccines that are available right now. Everyone should be aware there's 3 vaccines that are available. One just came on to the scene at this point. But the big ones that have been available over the last month or so have been the mRNA vaccines. So this is Pfizer's vaccine, and this is Moderna's vaccine. So we're going to talk a little bit about the technology, because this is some of the questions that people have. They don't really, I think, have a good understanding of how these vaccines were developed, kind of how they work in the body, what the potential side effects are going to be, how effective they are, and those kind of things. So we'll go through mRNA vaccines. So I asked my wife whether she had a good concept of what mRNA was, and she's not in the medical field, and so when I talked to her, she really didn't, and I don't know if the average person really has a good idea of what in the world mRNA is. So I'll try to give you an analogy to see if it makes a little bit more sense. But I always tell people you sort of got to go way back in time. If you don't have a big science background, you have to go back to your high school biology days when you had to study the cell, because we all at one point had to study the cell. So if you think of DNA, and people are familiar with the term DNA, right? That's kind of your master copy for what your cell is going to do, right? All the functions that your cell is capable of performing, it's basically based off what your DNA is. So your DNA sits in the nucleus, right? Kind of tucked away, but that's your master copy. So I want you to sort of think about kind of a general contractor, and he's going to build a neighborhood, right? And we got 100 houses in this neighborhood, and they're going to all look the same. We're going to make copies of these houses that all look the same. So what that general contractor is able to do is take that DNA, that master copy, and he's able to say, okay, today we're just going to make one component of that house. We're only going to make garages, right? So I want to give a message out to all my subcontractors building those 100 houses, and each one's working on a house, right? And all we're going to build today are garages, right? So we're going to make a copy of the garage plan, not the rest of the house, just the garage plan today. And we're going to send that out to all those subcontractors to build garages. So that's your message, right, to those subcontractors. And that's what this messenger RNA is. So your cell, when it says, okay, I want to make a certain protein for the body, it's going to basically, okay, we're going to produce an mRNA segment, kick it out to the cytoplasm, right? And if everyone can remember those ribosomes, that's what actually takes those mRNA segments and it makes a protein. So that's the part they're bringing into play here. Not doing anything with DNA, not doing anything with the nucleus. It's only mRNA. So the mRNA sits out there, produces a protein, and then we go from there with that protein. So when they inject that vaccine into your arm, right, it's got mRNA there. And the real catch here, so they've been working on this. This is not, people say, oh, this is newer technology. I would agree, in the world of medicine, things, the pace that things move is relatively new, but they've been working on mRNA vaccines for about 20 years. And this is the first mRNA vaccine that's ever been used in humans. But they've been working on this for a long time, and it wasn't really the mRNA, sort of idea that hung them up. It was the delivery. So mRNA is actually a pretty unstable material, right? It gets broken down by the body pretty quickly. So this lipid nanoparticle, which is up here in this upper left-hand corner, right up in here, this was sort of the way that they were able to deliver the mRNA without it getting degraded quickly. So, and what this is, a lipid nanoparticle is just a fancy way of just saying that this thing's it's made of fat, basically. And so it's this sort of covering around the mRNA, nanoparticle just being a very, very small particle. And so this is the stuff they had to work on for a very long time to figure out how to deliver mRNA into the body without it getting degraded quickly so it could do its function. So this is the part that was very difficult. But what they did, companies like Pfizer, like Moderna, they were able to determine the exact size of the particle, the composition of that particle that your immune cells like to gobble up, right? So you need these white blood cells, these macrophages that will go around, will take those particles up into them, and then they'll take that mRNA segment in the cytoplasm, they'll produce a protein, and then those white blood cells will say, okay, fine. They present it on the surface of the cell to the rest of the immune system. They say, hey, I found something here, I've got something here. Is this abnormal? Is this a foreign protein? And your immune system will look at it and say, yep, I don't recognize that guy. Something abnormal. We're going to go produce a response against it. And that's where it goes from there, and you get your immune response. So the other reason they were able to sort of do this quickly was the sequencing of microorganisms now, or even, to be frankly honest, human genomes and things, that has come a long way. They can do that fairly quickly. So to get the sequence of the coronavirus genome was not a big task, so they sequenced it very quickly. And then at that point, if you're working with mRNA as a scientist developing a vaccine, you just got to find that sequence that makes a specific protein that you're happy with, that you're going to get an immune response against. So they were able to walk through that process fairly quickly, which is why also when these variants are coming out, they are able to go back with this technology very quickly, adjust their sequence to account for those variants and the mutations that have occurred, and change things fairly quickly. So that's kind of the concept behind mRNA vaccines. The other big question that sort of speaks to the speed at which these things have been developed. I always tell people there's never been a point in the history of medicine where you've been able to move this fast on a clinical trial. And the reason is this: when you run a clinical trial, if you're doing a preventative vaccine trial, right, you have to basically assemble a group that's susceptible and then follow them out. If you're doing another therapeutic trial, like you've got cancer patients and you're giving them chemotherapy, you still, once again, have to take a group that has that disease state, right, and then follow them out for an outcome. That outcome may be death for that group. Here, we're just looking at incidence of COVID, right? So we already know, right, you've got this entire population in the world that's susceptible. So you have more patients than you've ever had to work with for anything, right? So everyone is susceptible, right? And then you have a disease that's extremely plentiful. We're not talking about a disease that's hitting here and there, right? This disease is spreading, immensely fast. So never, like I said, never have you had these circumstances where you have a disease that's so plentiful and a population that's so susceptible. So that's why they were able to get these clinical trials done quickly. So everyone knows we've got 2 vaccines that were available. Actually, they've been available for a couple months now. So Pfizer and Moderna, and I think most people here have probably received Pfizer if you've been vaccinated. But now in this area, there's a lot of people that are starting to get Moderna. Some of the other clinics are administering Moderna. So each of these got emergency use authorization back in December. So Pfizer, December 11th, and then a week later, Moderna got their authorization from the FDA. Interestingly, Pfizer was the only one that studied down to 16 years of age. So actually 16 and 17-year-olds can receive this vaccine. I don't know anyone who has, because they don't really fit into that eligibility criteria right now. Moderna is at 18 years of age and up. And these are both 2-dose series, right? So Pfizer's 3 weeks apart, Moderna's 4 weeks apart. And these were very large clinical trials. These were not small studies. So greater than 43,000 patients were in the Pfizer trial, and then greater than 30,000 in the Moderna trial. And the thing that was probably most amazing about these 2 trials, right, it was the effectiveness that came out of it. So Pfizer's was 95% effective, and Moderna was 94% effective. I can tell you these far exceeded the expectations of what people thought they were going to get out of these vaccine trials. So these were extremely effective at preventing COVID. And then the thing that's now been looked at is, do you actually cut down viral transmission? Because that's what we care about in a pandemic, whether you're passing that infection from one person to the next. We can talk a lot more about safety profiles, but when you look at the data, these have good safety profiles. We know you get the typical vaccine reactions in that first 24 to 48 hours, but overall these are very well tolerated. We'll talk a little bit about the allergic reaction issue. And then the only kicker on Pfizer was that they required very, very cold temperatures for storage, although I'll say now that's changed a little bit. If you're going to only hold it for a shorter period of time, they can use normal refrigeration now. That's really to hold it for several months. So one of the issues was this allergy concern that came out. There was these people that had these kind of really robust allergic responses. But the incidence of anaphylaxis here is about 1 out of 100,000. It may even be about more like 5 in a million. So I can tell you, when you use drugs like penicillin, the incidence of anaphylaxis is a lot greater than that. So we have no problem often giving out penicillin or amoxicillin, drugs like that, and they carry a much higher incidence. So usually we try to maybe think about avoiding this vaccine if you've got a history of severe allergic reactions, but it's really to that lipid nanoparticle, the components of that lipid nanoparticle. So you're not reacting to that mRNA. So that lipid nanoparticle has things like polyethylene glycol and polysorbates. For those of you who aren't familiar, polyethylene glycol, it's the same stuff we use, it's Ingo Lightly that we use to prep people for colonoscopies. So it's that type of a product. And so everyone knows if they've had a vaccine, right, you get observed for like 15 to 30 minutes after you've received it to make sure you're A-okay. All right, we'll switch gears a little bit and talk about Johnson & Johnson's vaccine. So this is a viral vector vaccine. So this is also relatively new technology. So basically, what they did here is a little bit different. So and it's a little bit more complicated. But here they took a virus. They took adenovirus, and adenovirus is a virus that can normally infect humans, right? And so they took that virus and said, okay, we're going to make a few changes to it. And so one of the key changes they made was that it was non-replicative. So it will not reproduce itself like a typical virus will in the body. So that was the one key thing, is it's able to sort of get into the cell initially, but then it can't replicate itself like it normally would do. So obviously we don't want a vaccine virus taking off at that point. So the other thing that they did is so adenovirus is a DNA virus. Some viruses are DNA, some viruses are RNA. Coronavirus is an RNA virus. But they took a small segment of RNA and they kind of inserted it into this genome, into the DNA of adenovirus, right? And so then what they do is they've got this adenovirus that can't replicate itself. It gets taken up by the cell like it normally would as a virus, and then it's brought in, and basically that DNA is then taken up, it's utilized so that you produce an mRNA transcript, and then that, once again, produces a protein that's displayed out. So if you look at this and say, geez, this has a lot more steps to it, right, than those mRNA vaccines. This is a lot more complicated, actually. Why in the world would you go to this method? Well, I can tell you the key here is the delivery method. So this is a lot more stable vaccine where you don't have to worry about that whole lipid nanoparticle technology. You don't have to worry about some of the storage issues that Pfizer's had to worry about. So the key with these vaccines is, and they're going to get utilized, in my opinion, a lot more in the world because they're a lot cheaper. But they're much more stable when it comes to things like storage. So, and just one thing I didn't comment on with the mRNA vaccines and with the viral vector vaccines, what they're trying to produce, that mRNA segment, or that little segment that's put in that adenovirus genome, you're encoding for that spike protein, right? So everyone's seen those pictures of coronavirus, right, where you get those spike proteins. That's the main protein of coronavirus that you're trying to produce an antibody against, right? So that's what you're trying to stimulate. So that's Johnson & Johnson's vaccine. And you say, well, has this technology ever been used in humans before? So this was the technology, and the answer was yes, but only in one other disease state. So everyone remembers Ebola a few years ago and all the problems that generated, right? So this is the technology they used to develop the Ebola vaccine, which is available now. So they got their emergency use authorization just about 2 weeks ago on February 27th, and this vaccine's already been being distributed in this community as it is all over the US. So the beauty of this one, of course, is that it's a single dose. And I will say they are studying a 2-dose series right now, but as of right now, with their authorization, it was for a single dose, 18 years of age or older. Once again, very large clinical trial, more than 43,000 patients. And then when you look at the data for this, it's a little bit different than the Pfizer and Moderna data. So once again, like I said, that Pfizer and Moderna data was phenomenal, right? It far exceeded expectations. This was pretty typical of what people expected to get. So it was 66% effective in preventing moderate to severe COVID. So the stuff that's really going to kind of hamper you a little bit. And really, the thing that we really care about is whether you get severe COVID, whether you end up in the hospital, whether you end up on a ventilator, whether you end up dead, right? So it was 85% preventing severe disease, but it kept you completely out of the hospital and did not allow for any death. So that was the thing we care about. So when you talk back at the 66% range, that also included those moderate COVID patients. Those are generally outpatients who are just having some significant symptoms at home. So, and in the US, it was a little bit better than that. It was about 72% because this was a multinational study done in other sites in the world. South Africa, we worry about a little bit, right? Because there's this South African variant that's out there that may be a little bit more aggressive. But even in South Africa, it was 64% effective. And it did have a good safety profile as well. AstraZeneca, everyone's heard about this company. This is one of the bigger companies that distributes to the world. I'm not going to say a whole lot about this, except that I think this is going to be one of the major distributors to the world, and it's mainly because they can produce it pretty cheaply, on the order of like $2-3 a dose. So this one was also developed with Oxford out of England. Basically, same mechanism as Johnson & Johnson. This is the one the World Health Organization has approved, but they have not submitted data in the US. It's a 2-dose series. And the only other good thing here for the rest of the world is that second dose can be given at 3 months. So now you've got this whole 3-month gap where you can get that first dose out to everyone before you got to worry about the second dose. 18 and up, large clinical trial. And this was actually 76% effective after a single dose. And the key thing, once again, completely protective against COVID-related hospitalization and death. And this was the first vaccine that actually showed reduced disease transmission, although I'll say there's growing evidence with these other vaccines that they also cut down disease transmission along with preventing illness. And then, like I already mentioned, low cost with this one. The last vaccine I'm going to talk about is actually not available yet, but this is Novavax. This is another US company, and it's a recombinant protein vaccine. So this is not new technology. So the vaccine that most people are familiar with that uses this technology would be the hepatitis B vaccine. So most of us here have been vaccinated for hepatitis B. This is exactly the same technology they use for that, where basically now they're not dealing with the genetics of it, they're just giving you the protein. And they're injecting that protein and saying, okay, your immune response, let's see what it does with that protein. So these are 2 doses, 3 weeks apart, 18 years and up have been studied. And in the United Kingdom, their clinical trial actually had good results. It was 89% effective. Big trial again. It was, unfortunately, a little bit less effective in South Africa. You have to remember one component about South Africa. There's a lot of HIV in South Africa. And so that does hamper them a little bit when they enroll for clinical trials there, because there is a component with HIV there, and whether they're controlled or uncontrolled. And then we're still waiting for US data with this company. So, but this is going to come down the line at some point this year, I'm sure. So I'm going to stop there and see what questions. There's certainly other topics we can talk about, and go from there.
I know that's not your statement or something, but how come we were able to get the vaccine for coronavirus so soon, but none of the others, like cancer, leukemia, all these other diseases that we have that are killing many people?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, they've actually looked at vaccines even in the oncology world, and vaccine development with some diseases is much more difficult than others. You're always trying to see what part of that virus or that bacteria or even a cancer that actually can produce a good immune response. And yeah, I can tell you in some infectious diseases, they've failed for a long time. HIV is an example, malaria is an example. So there's some things that have not worked out. And in this one, just like some other infectious diseases that we already get vaccinated with, they were able to find a sequence that produces good antibody responses. As far as the speed goes, we kind of talked about that. Just once again, you're dealing with a disease that's everywhere. You have a population that's susceptible everywhere. So, and it's a disease that's not long lasting, right? When you deal with cancer patients sometimes, those clinical trials are long, right? Malignancies go over years. This is something that goes where the disease process jumps and jumps and jumps, and it's short-lived, right? So you're able to get these things done a lot quicker.
Do they know how long the vaccination is going to last? Like, if we got it now, are we going to need another one next year?
Yeah, that's one of the key questions I get a lot. So, and right, it's unknown at this point, right? Because all you can do is those clinical trials for these vaccines started last summer. And so right now we're, 9 months out from them for the earliest, people that entered. And so we already know that at this point in the game, they still have robust antibody levels. So obviously you need more time to see where that's at and how long that's lasts. I think, the other question is, for people that have natural immunity from having had COVID versus those that get vaccine-induced immunity, the feeling is right now, based on the data, is that your antibody levels that you generate off the vaccine are probably more robust than the ones even off natural infection. And the problem with natural infection is highly variable, right? So you may get some people that get good responses and some people that don't. And the group I always worry about is that group that had maybe mild illness or maybe asymptomatic illness. I have a nephew who had an asymptomatic positive test, maybe had some very minimal symptoms, but I checked his antibody, a month out, and he had nothing. I've had COVID, I checked mine, I was positive, but once again, with natural infection, it's been more variable. I will say for a good chunk of those, because they've looked at New York City, they've looked at places like the United Kingdom and followed people out. Those people have pretty good immune responses down the line, but it is more variable as opposed to the vaccine, which probably gives a little bit higher levels and will be more sustained. But we don't know how long it's going to last. I think it's going to be pretty robust for a while. I mean, at the very worst, I think, is you're talking about an annual booster that may be available, but we may be very surprised in that your immunity may last 3 years, who knows, or beyond. I think, once again, that's totally unknown because we're only 1 year deep in this. And with the vaccine trials, we're only 9 months. But then for most of those vaccine trial participants, they're following them for at least 2 years. Any other questions?
I have another question.
Sure.
So we have a staff member that was out with COVID and was pretty sick, then got her levels tested and they were really low. So now she's is okay now to get the vaccination. So is that how you figure out if you should get the vaccination or not, if you don't have a?
So the recommendation right now would be not to necessarily check your antibody. And the problem is the commercial tests that are available to check your antibodies, I wouldn't say they're the most robust tests. And so one issue is your immune response, right? When you get infected with a virus or some other microorganism, right? Antibody production is only one component of what your immune system does. I would say your immune system is highly intricate, right? And it's highly capable of doing a lot of different things. It's got several arms as far as what it does. And so the antibody production arm is only one component that we're able to measure. Unfortunately, we can in the laboratory setting, but not in like the commercial lab setting where you go to the lab court. There's other arms, including what's called cell-mediated immunity that involves things like T cells that you can't measure well. But we know that when you get infected with things like this, that there's a good response on that end. And those people that don't have detectable antibody after they had COVID, they may have a very robust cell-mediated arm that takes care of things. And your immune system keeps a memory of things, right? And so that's the problem where we're at too, is that, we're only, once again, a year into this and seeing where people are gonna be at down the line. But right now, no recommendation to check your antibody levels. It is recommended, even if you had COVID, to go get vaccinated. And the time period you have to wait after you've had COVID, initially they said 90 days. That was really just to give the opportunity to other people to get vaccinated who didn't have any immunity at all. But really now that the vaccine's becoming more plentiful, basically you don't have to wait any significant period of time. I always tell people, get it once you've recovered from the illness, go ahead and get vaccinated. And certainly beyond that, they've sort of said don't wait beyond 90 days, because at that point, we have seen some reinfections occur for sure. They're unusual, certainly not common, but they do occur. And so I would generally say, and we've seen people where they've had the first dose of the vaccine, they've gotten COVID, and then the question is, should they just keep on trucking with the series? And the answer is yes, and they've done fine. And the other thing with the vaccine, it's been unpredictable, right? Who's going to get sort of these, you do have some people who get pretty robust responses. They don't feel real great for the next 24, 48 hours after they've had it. I always encourage people to take Tylenol, take ibuprofen. One of the theories was if you've had COVID, your immune system's already primed and you're going to get a vaccine and you're going to have a more robust response. I've talked to many people who had COVID and got vaccinated, including myself, and that was not the case. And I've seen people who've never had COVID and had a pretty robust response, but they were fine within 48 hours and didn't have any issue after that. So I would, like I said, take Tylenol and ibuprofen if you're going to get vaccinated for 24, 48 hours and try to stay comfortable and be done with it.
Quick question for you. I have numerous friends and family members who, when I ask them, are you going to take the vaccine, and their only response is, well, I don't want to receive it because it messes and changes my actual DNA. How would you respond to someone?
So especially when it comes to the mRNA vaccines, right? So I would say absolutely it does not, right? Your DNA resides in the nucleus, right? That mRNA gets taken up, it stays in the cytoplasm, does not enter the nucleus, does not interact with your DNA at all. And that mRNA gets degraded fairly quickly. It does produce that spike protein component, and that maybe hangs around for a couple weeks, but that's the part you want to hang around for a couple weeks because that's what your immune system is responding to. But that mRNA is not messing with your DNA at all. There's no alteration of your DNA whatsoever. So,
Is someone who's immunocompromised, are they less likely to have an immune response and for the vaccine to be effective?
So that group is being looked at right now a lot closer. They obviously weren't part of the original clinical trials. Generally, you take pretty healthy individuals for clinical trials. But now that group's getting more and more vaccinated and they can look at them. I always say the problem with immunosuppression is that's a wide range, right? We know some people that are heavily immunosuppressed and some people that are maybe more mildly immunosuppressed. Obviously, with any vaccine, you may not respond as well. The recommendation is to still, whether you've got autoimmune disease that you're getting immunosuppressive therapy, whether you're a cancer patient, whether you're an HIV patient, a transplant patient, the recommendation right now is to go get vaccinated, right? Because any potential protection is beneficial. And because we know those people potentially are going to have a lot more trouble when they end up with COVID. Some people have questions. Pregnancy, I can tell you right now, that's been one of the concerns with people. Right now, when you look at that registry that's available, so if you go get vaccinated, you can actually register with VSafe. And right now, there's about 45,000 individuals that were pregnant at the time of their vaccine on that database, and they have done just as well as the rest of the population. That's a pretty big group now. Obviously, pregnant individuals were not included in the clinical trials, although there were some individuals that got pregnant during the clinical trial. But right now, like I said, there's about 45,000 that have been vaccinated that they know of that have been registered. And then pediatrics, people ask about that a little bit. Those trials are ongoing right now. They're a little bit harder to accrue for, obviously. You've got to have parents that are willing to sign their kids up for a clinical trial to receive a vaccine. And they started with the teenage group right from about 12 and up. Pfizer already looked at those 16-year-olds, so Pfizer's doing 12 to 15 and the other companies are doing 12 to 17. That data is probably going to be out this summer, and then there'll be some recommendations, I'm sure, put forth about vaccinating that group, and then they'll go down from there. So as far as elementary age kids and below, I think unfortunately that data is going to take even longer, and that may be, by the end of the year if we get it. So they take a bit, obviously, for good reason. The other reason it takes longer in that group is because they don't get symptomatic disease as easy as adults do. So when you're looking at outcomes in clinical trials, it takes longer to sort of see that difference between your two populations, the unvaccinated and the vaccinated arm. Biggest thing I always say, the biggest, this has been the biggest hurdle right now is, right, we've got these vaccines available and getting people that take the vaccine is the current hurdle. And I think for a lot of individuals, they haven't really seen COVID, right? If they may know an individual that maybe had COVID and got through it just fine. They had a common cold and didn't have a big issue with it. And I think probably fortunate is that we don't have a lot of people that maybe have a loved one or a friend that had really bad COVID. But for some of us that work in the healthcare system, I mean, we've seen devastating effects from this disease. So, and I have not seen one devastating effect yet from the vaccine. I know there's a lot of theoretical concerns, and I always try to be respectful of people's views, but we saw our first case here at SRMC, I think in late March of last year. So this has been a year of watching COVID in this community, and it's been unbelievably destructive for some people and some people's families, right? We've seen plenty of deaths. And even the people that don't die, I've seen plenty of people just crippled by this illness, right? That are now on oxygen, right? Their lives have completely changed. Even people that have had milder illness, they don't end up in the hospital. But I can tell you, there's some people I know can't smell anymore, right? My wife ended up with tinnitus from COVID, which is ringing in your ears. And so I just think you have no idea, and that's the problem with this disease, right? I always say it's a little bit like spinning the roulette wheel, and you don't know where you're gonna land. It's highly unpredictable. People you think would do fine, don't do fine. And we have people that you think, oh my gosh, they're not gonna make it, and I've seen 90-year-olds get through. But that's the thing, is you have no idea. And in my opinion, choosing between potentially getting COVID versus taking the vaccine, I just think I know it's my opinion, it's an easy decision, but I would certainly absolutely get the vaccine. I think just COVID is probably not something I would mess around with. Any other issues, concerns, questions?
Dr. Malik, can you talk a little bit about how you see it coming out in the community and things like that right now?
So I would say I've actually been pleasantly surprised in the community. We've had a lot of people step up and provide the vaccine. That was my big concern when it came out too, was who in the world's gonna, because hopefully there's no one here from public health, but I butt heads with public health a little bit, but they weren't real organized. And I know it got dumped on them, and maybe people don't have all the appropriate support services to get things done, but this institution stepped forward, Dignity did, Shasta Community Health, the Rancheria, Vibra. So a lot of people sort of stepped forward and did vaccine clinics, and those vaccine clinics have been packed, right? I mean, for some people trying to get in, there's still people, I get calls all the time that, hey, can you help me get a vaccine? So I've been very pleasantly surprised by the amount of people that want to get a vaccine. I think we still have a long way to go. You kind of forget how big your population is and really how many people you need to get vaccinated. And fortunately, we live in an area where I think it's more available than most. I think you go into some urban areas, go into the Bay Area, go into LA, and it's a lot harder to get a vaccine. But we do see the numbers going down. I think we live in an area where luckily we're a little bit more socially distanced, and so I think our numbers are looking better than other areas. But we know nationwide things are going down at this point. And that's probably, partly, right, you're getting some of that herd immunity. We're not there yet. You really need to be up around 70-80% immunity before you're going to get that herd immunity. There's a group that's been infected, right? We're coming up on nearly 30 million infections for the U.S. But there's been, I think, about 100 million doses that have been administered in the United States so far. Some of those are people that have had 2 doses, some are just on their first dose. So hopefully we're getting there and things are getting better and better as we move forward. Masking's gotten better over time, but I think all of us want to reach an end to this. And I think waiting for everyone to get infected is not a very good way of getting there, in my opinion. I think the vaccine's a far better way, and it's a far faster way of getting there.
Talking about masking, what's your thoughts on Texas, Arizona, some of those southern states that are eliminating the masking mandate?
Yeah, I don't know if it's, I mean, in some of those areas, I guess, of whether it's going to have a major effect. I think people at this point, right, people mask because they think it's a good idea and they're trying to protect those around them or themselves. I don't know if it's going to be interesting in those areas to see whether you get a big shift. The CDC director came out and said, too, you know what, just because your governor says you don't mask anymore doesn't mean you can't mask, right? I mean, you can obviously mask up. And so I think the people that are, you know, that are saying, hey, great, we don't have a mask mandate, they probably weren't really serious about their masking anyway. So I think, luckily, as the pandemic got along, I think people sort of came, you know, on board with it a little bit more. And I think, you know, I think it's going to slowly fade off. People are eventually going to peel things off. The healthcare system is going to be a different arena than it is out in the public, right? I mean, and people are going to have to make their choices out in the public. I think in the hospital system, it's interesting this year because we've seen obviously a huge effect on what it does to viruses like influenza and RSV for kids. I mean, those two viruses that normally roar in the winter, they've been non-existent. So it clearly has some benefit. You're obviously not going to get the same benefit if we're only doing it in the hospital and no one's doing it outside of the hospital. You know, I hope that the idea of staying home when you're sick and away when you're sick, you know, sticks around so that we don't keep getting each other sick. So I think there's a number of factors that have played a role with cutting some of those other viral infections down. But I don't know, like I said, to answer your question, Jamie, whether it's going to change a whole lot, because I think people that believe in masking are going to keep masking in those areas.
So if you had COVID before and you have the antibodies, what's the vaccine gonna do if you already have the antibodies in your body?
So it's a good question. It's kind of a little bit unknown, right? But that's why I sort of spoke earlier about whether you've got a more predictable, prolonged, more elevated response with the vaccine than you do with natural infection. I said natural infection is more variable, right? I mean, you get this whole range of illness, and whether some people have a very good, robust response based on what they experienced versus someone else who maybe had a very mild illness, whose maybe immunity is going to fade after 2 or 3 months, that's sort of the unknown. You have a more, like I said, a more standard delivery of that protein that your immune system needs to respond to when you do when you receive a vaccine, and so you get a more, you know, a more robust and predictable response down the line than you may get from natural infection. But I think it's still, that part's a little bit unknown until we have more data, until we go further on down the line. But we do know, like I said, I mean, that reinfections can occur, they are unusual, but for those of us who've had COVID, right, most of us that, you know, no thank you, I don't want it again.
What about mutations? Like, is it gonna be like a yearly COVID vaccine, like a flu vaccine?
Yeah, so, and I kind of spoke to that earlier. I mean, I think it's potentially possible. That part's unknown. And we know all viruses mutate. Actually, you know, it's sort of the variants that have developed. You know, I think they haven't been so dramatic where the current vaccines are not able to provide some benefit, right? We know that the antibody levels that you generate off the vaccines that are currently available are going to be protective against those variants right now. And the level of protection is a little bit different when you talk about each variant. For that UK variant, which is now becoming very common in the US, they're very protective. For things like the South African variant, or there's variants coming out of South America, or whatever's coming down the line that we haven't seen yet, that remains to be seen. But the good thing is they have that technology where they can tweak that thing a little bit, they can start producing. So Moderna already is producing a booster right now. They're actually already testing a booster right now that accounts for some of those variations that have occurred, which is the benefit of that technology. You can run through it quickly and produce quickly. That brand.
If you do need a booster, you know, like if they decide you have to have one every year, every 2 years, are you gonna have to get the same vaccine each time?
No, you mean like with the same company?
Yeah, like if you had Pfizer to begin with in 2 years.
No, I don't think that's the case, and that's an interesting thing too. Whether you can sort of mix these vaccines, and that's they sort of recommended don't do that. You know, if you've gotten the first Moderna, get the next Moderna. But would you actually still have a very, you know, good boost off if your second dose was Pfizer? I think you probably would, but I don't think that's going to be an issue if you get a booster. Whether you got Pfizer originally, that you'd have to find the Pfizer booster. I think you'd be able to get whatever you know came down the line.
There's been talk about, you know, travel requirements for vaccination and stuff. So people, you have your vaccination card, and then that was one of the things that came onto that, just because I've seen that, like, even just like traveling to Alaska, places, proof of vaccination, or other countries, that's gonna be something. Gonna need to have a database or something to keep track of, or?
Well, I think absolutely. I think, and every country's different as far as what they're requiring right now. But that has been one of the issues for people that like to travel outside of the continental U.S. is that probably having proof of vaccination is going to be valuable, and some people don't want you in if you have not been vaccinated. But that's going to be highly variable based on where you're going. But that is absolutely going to be the case for some places for sure. They're going to want to have proof.
Have your passport and vaccination card.
Yep. And that's going to be for quite a while, right? You know, it's maybe 5 years down the line you won't have to, but for right now, you will. Okay. Any other issues? All right. You're welcome to grab me anytime, ask any questions anytime.